Welcome to Flying Eagle. Russia depends on oil exports, with China as its biggest buyer. But now, Beijing has blocked Russian tankers from key ports, shaking their alliance. What's behind this move and what does it mean for Russia's future? Let's find out. Subscribe for more breaking updates. China shuts out Russian oil tankers, a devastating setback for Moscow. China has made a surprising and consequential move by barring Russian oil tankers, specifically those sanctioned by the United States, from docking at one of its most critical ports. These vessels, which have been blacklisted by the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, are now denied access to unloading operations and port services at facilities managed by the state-owned Shandong Port Group, which oversees some of China's most important eastern ports, including Rizhao, Yantai, and Qingdao. This decision marks one of Beijing's most significant actions against Russia's shadow fleet, a network of oil tankers that Moscow relies on to circumvent Western sanctions and continue its energy exports despite growing economic restrictions. By blocking these vessels, China has disrupted a crucial channel for Russian oil shipments, significantly complicating Russia's efforts to sustain its revenue from crude exports. The impact of this decision is already reverberating through global energy markets. Shandong province is home to China's largest independent refiners, commonly known as teapot refineries, which process a substantial portion of the country's imported crude oil. In recent years, these refineries have become heavily dependent on Russian crude, which is often sold at discounted rates due to international sanctions. With Russian-owned tankers now facing docking restrictions, these refineries will be forced to reconsider their supply chains, potentially increasing their reliance on alternative sources such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, or even crude shipments from the United States. The shift in supply dynamics could lead to higher shipping costs, logistical delays, and increased price volatility in global oil markets as traders and energy analysts anticipate further complications in crude distribution. Despite the magnitude of the move, China's official response has been relatively muted. When questioned about the port restrictions, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun claimed to have no knowledge of the matter, but reiterated China's firm opposition to what he described as illegal and unilateral U.S. sanctions. However, the decision to enforce docking bans on Russian tankers suggests that China may be taking a more cautious approach toward dealing with sanctioned entities, possibly to avoid secondary sanctions or financial risks tied to its involvement with blacklisted vessels. While Beijing has maintained strong diplomatic and economic ties with Moscow, this development raises speculation that China might be subtly aligning with Washington's energy restrictions, or at least seeking to minimize its exposure to potential penalties. For Russia, this unexpected blockade represents a significant financial setback. Moscow has increasingly relied on its shadow fleet to sustain oil exports amid sweeping Western sanctions imposed after its invasion of Ukraine. Should China continue to tighten its stance, Russia may be forced to sell more oil via intermediary nations, offer deeper discounts to attract alternative buyers, or resort to longer and more expensive shipping routes. Additionally, this could drive Moscow to expand its reliance on countries such as India or Turkey, although such pivots may not fully compensate for the loss of a key partner like China. If China further restricts access to its ports or imposes additional limitations on sanctioned vessels, Russia's economic resilience could be severely tested. Beyond the immediate economic consequences, this move also carries broader geopolitical implications. China and Russia have positioned themselves as strategic partners, frequently pushing back against Western influence and sanctions. However, Beijing's decision to enforce restrictions on Russian oil tankers highlights the delicate balancing act it must perform between maintaining economic cooperation with Moscow and protecting its own national interests. If China continues moving in alignment with U.S. sanctions, whether intentionally or out of necessity, it could mark a subtle but notable shift in the Beijing-Moscow relationship, potentially altering the dynamics of global energy politics. As the situation unfolds, the world will be watching closely to see whether this represents a one-time enforcement or the beginning of a broader policy shift. For now, this unexpected blockade at key Shandong ports has delivered a major blow to Russia's energy trade and could signal an evolving strategy from Beijing that prioritizes economic pragmatism over unconditional support for Moscow. Russia's oil export future. Is a crisis on the horizon? Recent data from Kepler, a leading commodity market analytics firm, reveals that at least 8 massive crude oil tankers, each capable of carrying up to 2 million barrels, arrived at China's Shandong ports last month. Notably, these vessels primarily transported oil from Iran, a nation that, like Russia, has been under heavy U.S. sanctions for years. The increase in Iranian oil shipments to China comes at a time when Washington is tightening its grip on sanctioned crude trade, with Russia now becoming a primary target of these expanded restrictions. In a significant escalation, the U.S. Treasury Department, in coordination with its allies, has blacklisted 35 companies and vessels involved in the transport of Iranian oil. This aggressive crackdown is not only aimed at Tehran, but also indirectly affects Russia's shadow fleet, a network of tankers used by Moscow to bypass Western sanctions and continue its lucrative crude exports. With China's recent move to bar sanctioned Russian oil tankers from docking at key Shandong ports, the outlook for Moscow's oil trade is becoming increasingly uncertain. A pressing question now arises. Where will Russia's sanctioned tankers go next, now that they've lost access to one of China's most crucial oil hubs? Beyond the immediate logistical and economic disruptions, this development carries profound geopolitical implications, particularly for China-Russia relations. The partnership between Moscow and Beijing has long been characterized by a blend of cooperation and strategic rivalry, shaped by their shifting geopolitical interests. Although their relationship has strengthened in recent years, largely due to their shared opposition to U.S. influence, many analysts argue that this alliance is more tactical than deeply rooted, built on mutual necessity rather than genuine trust. If China continues to distance itself from Russia's sanctioned oil operations, it could signal a major shift in the balance of power between the two nations. Historically, Russia has viewed China as an essential economic partner and a critical market for its energy exports, particularly after Europe drastically reduced its reliance on Russian crude following Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. However, Beijing's increasing dependence on Iranian oil, coupled with its cautious stance on handling sanctioned Russian vessels, suggests that China may be prioritizing its own economic stability over unwavering support for Moscow. For Russia, the growing isolation of its oil sector could force it to divert more shipments to less favorable markets, rely on complex and costly shipping routes, or offer steeper discounts to attract alternative buyers. If China takes further steps to limit Russian oil imports or tighten enforcement on sanctioned vessels, Moscow's economic resilience could face even greater challenges. Ultimately, this shift could reshape global energy dynamics, with China emerging as the dominant power in its relationship with Russia. If Moscow finds itself increasingly dependent on Beijing's goodwill for its economic survival, it could lead to a power imbalance that forces Russia into a weaker bargaining position on broader political and economic issues. While the full impact of these changes remains to be seen, one thing is clear: Russia's oil export future is now more uncertain than ever, and a deeper crisis may be on the horizon. China's quiet economic stranglehold on Russia. The economic relationship between China and Russia is evolving at an unprecedented pace, fundamentally reshaping Moscow's financial and geopolitical landscape. As Western sanctions have severed Russia from its traditional trading partners, Moscow has turned to the east, making China its primary economic lifeline. However, this growing reliance has come at a steep cost, exposing deep vulnerabilities in Russia's financial stability and shifting the power dynamic heavily in Beijing's favor. One of Moscow's greatest challenges is China's tight grip on currency controls and its dominant position in trade negotiations. As Russia grows increasingly dependent on China for commerce, energy sales, and financial services, Beijing is able to dictate the terms of their economic relationship. In an attempt to counter Western financial restrictions, Russia has aggressively pushed for the wider adoption of the digital ruble, hoping to strengthen its financial autonomy. However, this strategy appears largely ineffective, as Russia remains deeply tied to Chinese financial infrastructure, with the yuan rapidly becoming the dominant currency in Russian foreign transactions. Meanwhile, reports indicate that Chinese banks are expanding their operations in Russia, stepping in to provide financial services to businesses that were previously reliant on Western institutions. This shift has allowed Beijing to increase its financial influence over Russian markets, with many Russian banks and companies now dependent on Chinese loans to sustain operations. China's state-owned banks have systematically embedded themselves into Russia's economic framework, ensuring that any financial maneuvering by Moscow will require Beijing's approval. The bigger picture: China is steadily tightening its grip over Russia's economy. With its recent move to block Russian oil tankers from docking at Shandong ports, Beijing has sent a clear message. It holds significant leverage over Moscow's financial future, and it's not afraid to use it. If this trend continues, Russia's economic sovereignty could be increasingly compromised, making it ever more dependent on Beijing's decisions and priorities. In essence, while Russia sought to escape Western financial dominance, it may have simply traded it for a new economic master, China. The hidden conflict behind China and Russia's alliance. While China and Russia often publicly present themselves as close allies, their relationship is far from one of deep-rooted trust and unity. Despite frequent declarations of friendship, the reality is that their ties are complex and marked by historical tensions, strategic rivalries, and mutual suspicion. The two countries share an extensive 600-mile border, which has been the source of several territorial disputes throughout history. These disputes are a reflection of the ideological and geopolitical differences that have also existed between the two nations for centuries. Despite their shared interest in opposing Western influence, particularly from the United States and NATO, both countries continue to harbor reservations about the other's motives and strategic objectives. Although Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping have met over 40 times, their nations have never formalized a military alliance in the way that NATO or other defense organizations operate. This lack of a formal agreement speaks volumes about the cautious approach both countries take when it comes to truly trusting one another. In fact, many analysts argue that the China-Russia partnership is more of a marriage of convenience than a genuine long-term strategic alliance. At its core, their cooperation is driven largely by their shared opposition to Western influence and the desire to challenge the existing global order, rather than a deep mutual trust. However, recent events suggest that this partnership may be more fragile than it appears. One notable development is China's recent decision to block Russian oil tankers from its ports, which has sent shockwaves through the global energy market. This action is significant because China has been one of Russia's most important trading partners, particularly in the wake of Western sanctions imposed on Russia. These sanctions, which target key sectors of the Russian economy, have made China an even more critical market for Russian oil and gas exports. By refusing to allow Russian tankers to dock at its ports, China has signaled that it is willing to put its own national interests ahead of its relationship with Moscow. This move raises questions about whether China is beginning to quietly distance itself from Russia, especially as it seeks to maintain its own economic stability and global influence. The question then becomes, what happens if China decides to further scale back its economic ties with Russia? If China stops being a reliable partner for Russian energy exports, it could spell disaster for Russia's already fragile economy. This is especially troubling for President Putin, who has relied heavily on China as a major economic lifeline since the onset of the sanctions. Without China's support, Russia could face even greater isolation, forcing it to seek alternative markets and partnerships that might not be as favorable or lucrative. Moreover, China's actions suggest a growing awareness of the geopolitical risks associated with being too closely aligned with Russia, especially as the global balance of power continues to shift. A dangerous game of power and influence. For years, Vladimir Putin has proudly championed Russia's efforts to de-dollarize the global economy, boasting that Moscow is working to break free from the dominance of the US dollar in international trade. However, the reality of this ambition is far more complicated. Despite Russia's moves away from dollar-based transactions, it is China that now holds significant economic power over Russia more than ever before. In 2023 alone, 46% of Russia's foreign currency transactions were conducted in Chinese yuan, a sharp rise from previous years. This growing reliance on China has given Chinese state-owned banks a major foothold inside Russia, allowing Beijing to exert considerable influence over Moscow's economic and financial landscape. What began as an economic partnership driven by mutual geopolitical interests has evolved into something more complex. China's financial reach has gradually ensnared Russia in a massive web of trade, investment, and financial obligations. This shift has dramatically increased China's leverage over Russia, making Moscow vulnerable to Beijing's economic decisions. With this growing financial dominance, China now holds a more significant position in Russia's economy than ever before, and Beijing's actions could have serious consequences for Russia's future. In a move that could shake the very foundations of the China-Russia alliance, China may be playing a high-stakes economic game against Russia. Beijing has the power to tighten its grip on Russia, restricting trade, investment, and even financial flows into the country. If China decides to limit or halt certain forms of trade with Moscow, Russia could face severe economic repercussions. With Russia's economy already fragile from years of sanctions, dwindling resources, and mounting global isolation, a loss of economic support from China could prove catastrophic. This would leave Russia with few options, as its remaining economic allies, such as India or Iran, do not offer the same financial strength and global reach as China does. At the heart of this situation lies a critical question. What will happen if China decides to pull back further from Russia? If Beijing begins to restrict trade or reduce its financial involvement, Russia will face serious challenges to its survival as a global economic power. Its ability to withstand such a shift is highly uncertain, and the consequences could ripple through the entire geopolitical landscape. As the relationship between these two countries becomes increasingly asymmetrical, Russia's dependence on China could deepen, but so could its vulnerability to Beijing's strategic decisions. One thing is clear: this is a turning point in global geopolitics. The balance of power between China and Russia is shifting, and as China continues to expand its global influence, Russia's future looks more uncertain than ever. The once strong partnership between these two nations is now being tested by economic forces that neither can fully control. Whether this relationship can endure, or whether China will ultimately decide to tighten its economic grip on Russia, will likely define the next chapter in global power dynamics. So what do you think? Is China deliberately setting a trap for Russia, or is this just a temporary political maneuver? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, if you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest updates.